Evening, wherever you're joining from. Thank you for being here for another webinar, part of the WorldFAIR series presenting project outputs. Today, we're talking about guidelines, recommendations, and tools from the case studies in chemistry and nanomaterials. Some housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel and on our website. There will be a Q&A session at the very end, so please post your questions in the chat during the presentations, and our speakers will address them towards the end of the webinar. So we have been running our webinar series now for a year, and we are coming to the end of the project at the end of the series. So next month, on the 8th, we will hear from the final meeting from Cultural Heritage and Social Surveys. On the 20th of May, we'll hear from Geochemistry and Disaster Risk Reduction. And finally, on the 30th of May, we will hear from Population Health. You can find all the past webinar recordings, the presentations, and the registration information about our upcoming webinars on the WorldFAIR website. The link is here on the slides, and I will also put it in the chat after my presentation. So for today, our speakers, we will begin with Dr. Stuart Chalk from the University of North Florida, professor in the Department of Chemistry and trained as an analytical chemist, now focusing on the areas of chemical informatics and data science. Next up, we will hear from Evan Bolton from the National Library of Medicine, NIH. He is directing chemistry efforts at the National Center for Biotechnology Information and manages the PubChem project. Finally, we will hear from Dr. Isolde Lynch from the University of Birmingham, who is the Deputy Director for the Facility of Environmental Nanomaterials Analysis and Characterization at the University of Birmingham, and her research focuses on the environmental interactions of nanoparticles and nanostructured surfaces with biological entities from macromolecules to organisms. Our agenda for today, we will start with Stuart Chalk's presentation on the training cookbook developed by our work package 3. We will then proceed with Evan Bolton on the protocol services, standardized programmatic access to chemical information. And finally, we will hear from Isolde Lynch, who will present the latest outputs of the case study in nanomaterials. Finally, we will have a panel conversation, and the panel will also address your questions. And with this, I pass on the floor to Stuart.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Okay, hopefully everybody can see the screen. As Alex said, my name is Stuart Chalk, and I'm one of the leads of the different sub-packages within the chemistry package of WorldFAIR. As you can see in the graphic on the left-hand side, we are one of 11 different disciplinary groups that have been working on advancing FAIR for each of our respective disciplines. And today, I'm going to speak on the training package, and then my colleague Evan Bolton is going to speak about the utility services that have been developed under 2 of the 3 sub-projects. So the FAIR Training Cookbook is an idea about how to support chemistry and align disciplines with knowledge and tools, recipes about how to implement FAIR in different situations. One of the things that probably, if you know FAIR, you realize is that FAIR is a set of guidelines, and so we have to implement this for chemistry specifically. And so this activity is centered around trying to come up with recipes that will help in different situations where chemists will need to either go find data, represent data, or upload data, and then other tools in different places in the data workflow. This project has a great group of project members, as you can see on the right-hand side. And I'm going to go through, just real quick, some of the features and scope, an example use case, the development that we've gone through, some of the recipes that are up on the first version of the cookbook, how we plan to get additional content for the cookbook, and where this is going after the WorldFAIR project has ended. So, as I said, we want to try and come up with some routines, demonstrations, templates for how to use standards, for instance. Our UPAC has a number of standards that in the chemistry space that obviously we would like to continue to promote and encourage the community to use. This includes things like identifying and extracting chemically relevant metadata to be included in those standards, and compiling and validating chemical data, which is a very important topic in a general sense and something that IUPAC is broadly working on. We want to try and enable best practices and present practical tools for chemists of different types. And that includes undergraduate students, graduate students, those in industry, those in academia teaching, but also chemists in industry who may not be so familiar with FAIR, and how that might be an important topic to promote within the company to make a company much fairer in how they deal internally, maybe, with their data. And so, as you can probably imagine, the number of target audiences here is quite broad. We're looking at, as I said before, those in sort of education, but those in different kind of positions that may be wanting to get into data science, but also tool and service providers around the chemistry discipline. And also there are professionals that are maybe more data centric, and as a consequence, kind of training them or helping them understand what chemistry needs from the side of representation of data and how we are dealing with data, and in particular, maybe chemical representation. So quite a broad scope here, and that is something that we have obviously discussed a lot in the meetings that we've had over the last 2 years. So just to give a quick example of a scenario where scientists may be interested to go further and do things that are more fairly aligned. If one of the activities within FAIR that is very important to promote is the reuse of data. And so if there is a data set like this one, which is available on the IUPAC GitHub organizational site, how would somebody, or what would somebody need to think about or do to be able to sort of reuse this data? And so these are sort of the kinds of activities that we're trying to help the community work with. So dealing with data in Excel or relational databases, how to search, filter, sort, normalize, which is a very important topic area in data science, data, and not just numerical data, of course, but the representation of chemical species, as indicated by SMILE strings, for instance, is one example of an identifier. Source documents, there's obviously a lot of research out there, and being able to sort of almost go back to the literature and, if necessary, validate data that has been curated out of the research literature. And for the data scientist, of course, some of these things are not familiar. And so we would also need to be able to help discuss what these, for instance, identifiers are, like SMILES, and how they are different from other identifiers, and in particular, sort of what use cases would they be appropriate for, so that we can make sure that from a data side, a data expert knows why they would store a certain particular identifier versus another one. So again, a lot of interesting topics to obviously bring to light. And so these have all played into obviously the content that we're trying to develop within the cookbook. And this again is to focus on, you know, how do we promote FAIR within the chemistry community? How do we enable it and make sure that users can not only understand what they can do in certain situations, but also caveats as to how they should do it and things to be careful about. So standards, reuse of chemical data sets. We wanted to come up with a platform that was easy to use and open. Obviously, this is a project about FAIR, so it made sense that what we would develop would be as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And then obviously promoting the FAIR data principles in the context of the site and the content. So we've actually decided on and are implementing a Python-based Jupyter book, which is a specific package that you can install in Python. And we're doing that through GitHub. So everything is online and openly available. Here's a quick look at the front page of the cookbook. I'm going to go into some recipes in a second here. So the main website, this is the front page of, is actually created from the content that is in the GitHub repository using an automated script. So the content itself is actually generated in what are called markdown files, which are basic text files, which have some syntax to them that you can create with formatting for different pieces of a web page. You can also include Jupyter notebooks, which is a different thing than a Jupyter book. And those are basically interactive files that you can work through Python on a website. And so that's very important and very useful in the context of demonstrating the Python code in particular. We manage everything, like I said, from GitHub. So there is a GitHub repository behind this website. And from an administrative perspective, the content of that GitHub repository is actually local on an admin machine like myself, where I can basically administrate the uploading or the publishing of new recipes into the cookbook. Because of the use of GitHub, we have, as I said before, open development. GitHub has issues where you can track community issues relative to the website. But we're also using it to facilitate community contributions because we can encourage the community to provide a new recipe using what's called the GitHub pull request mechanism. And when we do that, we can then have reviewers actually review those new recipes and feedback to the contributors how those recipes need to be updated, and then finally accept them to be published within the cookbook. So in a sense, this is basically sort of like a very open journal publishing process, although of course it's kind of a different mode. GitHub also has some other functionality to be able to do discussions and a wiki, and we're using the wiki in particular to help communicate how to make contributions to the cookbook. So just to give you some quick examples, this is one which is a Jupyter notebook, so it can be launched on the web and run by the user. I've opened up the top box here, which has a lot of metadata about each individual recipe. So in this case, it obviously talks about the author and the reviewer, but also skills needed to be able to sort of appreciate this particular recipe, learning outcomes, and a citation. Each one of the contributions, each of the recipes has a citation and a unique identifier, and is obviously open as well in terms of its license. If I now take this and open it up on a site called Binder, I can actually see this particular file, this notebook, operating. And in fact, what we're seeing here is where we've run both of the first two sections here. It's displayed the chemical compound that's been loaded into this variable. And then this is just indicating that we have a variable in memory to be able to then go on and do additional steps in this particular recipe. This is showing the same one on Google Colab. And so we basically have functionality whichever ways a user is interested in viewing the notebook. Another example, in this case now using an API to go and grab data from a website. Again, we have a Jupyter notebook, and this can be launched into, in this case, Colab. And what we're seeing here on the screen is the Python code right here with some explanation on the right-hand side, where a particular defined term on the IUPAC Goldbook website has been identified, and then the code for it, this C10093, is the code assigned to this particular definition of this term. And then finally down here, we have some more Python code that goes using this template URL, subs in this particular code value into this URL, and then spits out the actual metadata that comes from the API on the website. And then finally, in this code down here, goes and extracts out the actual text of the definition. So this is a really great example of showing how Python can access an API and pull down the data. And this is the actual data that was actually at that link. So you can see there's more information that can be pulled out of there and obviously used it however someone would like to do in code. Finally, we've got another example here. This is a particular use case where we're looking at how we might use this for explaining being more fair with your data, how you use your data, how you identify data. So in this case, we've got a lot of metadata fields that have been described that are important in terms of defining a UV vis or an ultraviolet visible spectrum. And then in Python, we can actually have the code go through and load in a file that contains the XY data of this spectrum. So this could be used in education where students could go in and actually load in their own spectrum that they've been able to gather on an instrument. And then we can actually not only display the spectrum, as you can see, but we can also go and do an analysis of it. And this is actually just picking out the maximum absorption peak and determining an important parameter relative to that peak. So this is a really great way to show off how to be fairer and use it in the context, obviously, of chemistry examples. One of the things we've been working on recently is to allow the community to contribute to this. And so we actually have 3 different mechanisms by which users can contribute new content. If you don't know anything about GitHub and Python, you can actually contribute something through what's called a GitHub issue, and then we will make sure it gets loaded up into the system for review. The traditional way is to fork the GitHub repository, go ahead and put a new recipe together and then submit it as this thing called a pull request. And finally, we're anticipating that we will have what we will call trusted contributors to be able to sort of almost just locally add new contributions as they develop them. And so we put up a set of instructions on the wiki, on the GitHub website. As I said, we've assigned unique IDs for each recipe when they're approved. And then we're developing a wish list of recipes that we would like to encourage the community to contribute as well. Obviously, the project is winding down now because the WorldFAIR project is ending. We are planning on, of course, keeping this going, and this is an IUPAC project. We're going to develop a roadmap, target specific contributors in the community that are cheminformatics related. Obviously, do a lot of community engagement to try and help generate these additional recipes that we want to put into the cookbook. And we're trying to sort of anticipate where this might go. So we're wondering if this site might end up being kind of like an open source journal, because obviously the review process seems very similar to that. This is going to be great for enabling developers in the chemistry space, and in particular for helping to train trainers. And we're looking to partner with universities and professional societies to really get the word out, but also solicit interest and obviously contributions as well. Final slide, we have a couple of QR codes here. One is to an original, excuse me, one of them is to an original demo that we put together. And then this link right here goes to the website that I just mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. And now we are on to Evan.
Sharing my screen. You should be able to see my screen.
Okay, thanks.
So it's my pleasure to talk to you about the protocol services, which is D3.3. So the basic genesis of this is thinking about, we have FAIR data and we have ways of working with information. And a lot of this is being backported into the context of resources that we have across the web, but also within the various enterprise. But we also have a fair number of existing protocols for people to access chemical information. And a big issue is that each resource has developed, independent of all the others, their own silo of programmatic services. You can imagine that if the web was the same way, every time you wanted to go to a different website, you'd have to use a different protocol. You couldn't use HTTPS, or you'd have to use some other one. What a pain that would be. You know, you could imagine that if chemistry had some means to you could work with the entire domain in some systematic common way, that would be a huge opening for resources to do so much more. If you also think about it from the perspective of different domains of science, what if geochemistry or oceanography or astrobiology wanted to access chemistry information? They wouldn't have to just pick a single resource or a small set of resources. They could access all of chemistry in some way. So we developed this idea of protocol services as a standardized way for programmatic data exchange. So as we make things fair, you can imagine you don't have silos of fair resources where you need to access it, but you could access all of them in a fair way. So if you can imagine this backporting into an existing environment where there are so many different resources that exist already with their own interfaces, we have to start somewhere. So the idea is to start with two most basic things. If you have a chemical description that you want to use with a particular resource or across resources in general, you can ask the question, do you even know what I'm talking about? Can you understand this chemical substance as a description that is useful for this particular resource? So if you had a crystal structure and you're trying to show it to a organic chemical database that doesn't understand anything about crystal structures, it could say, no, I have no idea what this is, and provide some feedback in that way. Or vice versa, you could say, yes, this is a crystal structure, and yes, I understand what this is. The other aspect is, do you have any information about this thing? So we have two most basic ideas. Do you understand what I'm talking about? And is this something that you have any information about? And so we have this idea of a global chemical resolver and a chemical structure validity checker to be able to handle these two basic aspects. So if you have the idea of a name, if you have an IUPAC name, Smiles, Mole File, Itchy, you name it, there are so many different file formats and flavors, and way that we deal with chemical information is often based on what you have. If we had some means to know what it is required or needed, I'm just trying to make this hide. We would need some way of describing the chemical structure. And how do we know if structure representation is correct? We built a prototype tool which allow you to provide information in various ways. In this case, we're demonstrating is from the perspective of PubChem, but also in the context of RDKit. You can imagine this could be anything, but this is just really a demonstrator. Here I have a particular structure, and I'm getting back information in a JSON format data blob. And you're getting back a message here. This structure is valid. I have butane, and it gives some additional information about it. Well, what if you have something which is a more complex structure? You can, in this case, you're putting in a glucose, and you have one undefined stereocenter. In this case, maybe that's important to you, maybe it's not. You have some way of describing, yes, this is valid, or no, this is invalid. If you want to back a chemical structure, providing back an image also helps a user or a chemist visualize what we interpret this as. But what happens if you have something which is wrong? You have 5 bonds to carbon. You can say, no, this structure is invalid. This is not something I can use. You can provide this all back from a machine perspective. There's also a demonstration that you can launch within Colab. You can provide and play with this to the extent that works best for you with different formats and different flavors. And you can, in theory, work with other resources that also support the same services. So we have a number of goals to work with this. There's an IUPAC project that will provide continuity beyond WorldFAIR. The idea is to expand the set of organizations that will use this, provide additional feedback for additional services that go beyond a simple structure checker from a perspective of a given resource, but then also the idea or context, do I have any information about this thing? We need also to consider a wider approach. You can imagine there may be hundreds of different chemistry resources which have some information about a given structure. If they all speak the same protocol, it's possible to do various forms of federated queries across many resources simultaneously. So we can imagine tools that would allow you as a researcher or as a particular branch of science wanting to ask certain basic questions, what areas of chemistry have information about this, which may also provide additional data that may be useful. You can also imagine about the metadata associated to each organization or each different data system that would support this. Would also be an area of development to flesh out so that people can categorize or target the type of data they would like to search in the future. In the end, you can imagine a future where chemistry information is open and available to everyone, not just those which are in the know, how to use one API or another API, and the barrier for accessing chemical information as a whole would be dramatically reduced. So this is our goal, to continue this forward within the context of IUPAC, to define additional functions, to gather additional contributors, people who would be happy to be involved, and then to flesh out the areas that are useful to other branches of science as a whole. So I just need to thank the PubChem team, especially Paul Teason and Sungwon Kim, for their efforts. So Paul Teason, he created the initial protocol service and validation aspects so they could access and work with both RDKit and in addition to PubChem. He also developed the Jupyter Lab in conjunction with Sungwon Kim for this work. We also have to thank NCBI and NLM and NIH for their support of this project, but also to our PubChem data contributors and all our many different collaborators. So if you'd like to learn more about the protocols demo and protocol services, there's a couple QR codes. Just encourage you to take a moment to either take a picture or otherwise use your camera phone to navigate it, or take note of the bit.ly paths here so you can access it. With that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks to both of our speakers from the chemistry work package. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Evan. Now we are on to Isolde from the case study on nanomaterials.
For some reason, my Zoom is now saying it can't detect it. Oh, I know why, because I pressed a button. Okay, there we go. Now you should be able to see me again. Okay, there's obviously a button on my keyboard that I hadn't realized I pressed. Right, let me now share my screen, and then I will present the update on the nanomaterials case study. Perfect. Thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for being here. So I am going to focus most of what I say today on the deliverable that we prepared in the nanomaterials case study on verification of nanoinformatics tools and models. So how we not just verify the data that's used in models, but how we verify the models and the software related to those models as well. But before I go into the detail, I just want to remind you that nanomaterials have features both as chemicals, but also as particles. So in the diagram that Stuart showed of the WorldFAIR petals, or in fact here as you see it in the top, nanomaterials are the second one. So we sit between pure chemistry and geochemistry because we have a lot in common also with geological materials. And the reason we have to think about both the chemistry and the particle nature is because the properties of our materials and their behavior in the environment and their behavior as they interact with us as humans are dominated by their surface chemistry, but also influenced by their core chemistry. And because there are such a wide range of sizes, shapes, geometries, structures, and surface modifications of nanomaterials, all of which may have the same underlying core element, ECHA, which is the European Chemicals Agency, introduced the concept of nanoforms as a way of allowing us to group nanomaterials that behave similarly versus those that don't. And it might be something just as simple as particles of gold below 30 nanometers might behave one way, and above that, they might behave a different way. And we need to be able to classify those. So that's really just a very brief introduction to why nanomaterials has its own case study, because it is both a chemical and a particle. So and that introduces all sorts of new things that we need to think about in terms of the data and how we make that data fair. So our first deliverable, and this was one of the presentations we had previously that Alex already mentioned, was our first deliverable was to look at the FAIR implementation profile, which is a way of describing the current state of a field and what are the FAIR enabling resources that that field uses. So this was published in Zenodo as our first deliverable, and it was mapping of the FAIRification or the FAIR resources supporting nanomaterials and nanomaterial safety. So I'm not going to spend any time on that other than pointing you to the link. The one I'm going to spend the most time on today is talking about real-time solutions to enable FAIR nanoinformatics models and tools. And again, this was just recently published, and the link there to Zenodo is there. And here we were really focusing on presenting best practice examples to documentation of models and software using existing and emerging metadata standards, proposing the establishment of a registry of nanoinformatics models, and then how we might deploy predictive models as web applications or through APIs in order to enhance their reusability of the models as well. So that's what I'm going to spend most of today talking about. But just before that, I want to very briefly mention the final deliverable that we're working on. This is not yet publicly available because we're only finalizing it for the end of this month for then it to go under review. And this is really looking at how we make our data provenance and persistence policies more transparent. And particularly in the case of nanomaterials, we've been using this concept called an instance map, where it is a way of visualizing anywhere where the nanomaterials surroundings might change, and that change in surroundings might lead to a new set of properties of the particle. So we were initially thinking about this as a way of describing the nanomaterial's fate and where we need to have additional characterization and data around it. But more recently then we've been thinking about how it might also allow us to look at things like the nanomaterial's provenance. So how the material was created, how it was stored, how it was transferred, who was responsible for each of those steps, and what characterization was done around it. So that's the focus of our final activity. And this is a rather complicated figure, but these instance maps allow us to look at both the material's provenance, so where the material itself came from, then distinguishing that from a sample. So our nanomaterial might well then be dispersed in a particular solvent, or it might then be dispersed in a cell culture medium in order to perform a toxicity test or it might be in a specific environment if it was released from a product. So we can also then think about the sample, and for each of those then there's a set of data provenance, so the data related to each of those samples and sampling events, and we're able to map these all to a very easy to use tool that's very intuitive. It's just kind of plug and play, and that allows the experimental researchers to understand what the data and metadata needs are associated with their experiments. So keep an eye out for that deliverable, which will be coming in due course. We've also been working for a number of years now on this sort of collective inventory of all of the nano resources related to verification. So that's the link there to the NanoCommons user handbook, which has sections on verification, on knowledge management, on nanoinformatics, and then on some dissemination cases and things. So there's lots of really good information there. What we've been doing in this particular deliverable is looking at where there are existing standards for documenting nanomaterials models. And nanomaterials models or nanoinformatics models typically come into two distinct categories. So the first category is the data-rich models or the data-driven models, where you have a large data set and you're then trying to find some commonalities between the structure or property of the nanomaterial and the effects that it induces. So structure activity or structure property relationships. And these are very well established for chemicals. So there's a well-established QSAR model reporting format. So a standard way of reporting the QSAR model, and it describes each of the different steps, including the mechanistic interpretation, and it's all underpinned by an OECD standard. So this is a really well-established standard that we use and we can implement for nanoinformatics models as well. Another approach for modeling of nanomaterials or materials modeling more generally is the so-called physics-based models. And these are where you're using sort of first principles or physical principles to determine a model. And here there was something called the MODA template, the modeling documentation template. And this is also a way of linking models and connecting, say, the output of one model as the input to another model. And again, this is a sort of a pre-standard. There was a CEN workshop agreement about these MODA templates. So when we were developing our FAIR implementation profile for nanomaterials, in our initial version, we hadn't thought to include these sorts of documentation standards, but in our revised FAIR implementation profile, we have now included these. And these are important because they document the principles of the model. They also document the data that went into forming the model and how the models are being integrated. So what we also did was there was an RDA group looking at FAIR for research software. So one of the things we did in this deliverable was map each of the two standards, the standard for QSAR modeling and the standard for materials modeling, and we map them to the FAIR principles as they were defined for research software. So the F principles, the A principles, the I principles, and the OR principles. And we identified whether this each of the two standards allow us to say that, yes, we are complying with the principle, the sub-principle of FAIR. So I'm not going to talk through each one, but that you can see, for example, that there is some, for example, different versions of the software are assigned a distinct identifier, principle F1.2. So in the QSAR modeling, the QMRF report, there is some versioning available, but it's maybe not as explicit as MODA, whereas the MODA then captures the version of the software used, and the MODA templates can also be versioned. So it allows us to see how these standards can help us make our models fair. So we've done that also for the A and the I principles. There you can just see very briefly. I'm not going to, because of time, go through everyone, but I just wanted to show you that we've done this mapping, and that in both cases, both of these standard or pre-standard approaches really do help us to make our nanoinformatics models and the software fair. And the one thing one of the things that emerged from this is that we probably do need to differentiate between the model itself, which is in many cases the grouping principle, or the physics-based model. It is the particular equation that we're using to underpin the model. And then the software is typically how we're presenting that. So the software is typically the deployment as a web service, for example, or the workflow through the API, for example. So again, we have a sort of an approach for physics-based models and for our data-driven or QSAR type models. And we've mapped each of these depths of documentation to the FAIR principles. So again, using these standard reporting formats addresses F1, F2, and A2. And then once we start to put the data into a database and the metadata submission, we then address an additional group of principles. And then as we deploy the model as a software, we then address a wide range of other ones because, for example, if we now have it's retrievable by an identifier through a standard communication protocol. So, for example, if we have an API. And so forth. So I know there's a lot of detail in this, but the deliverable describes it in a lot more detail. We also then try to show it for a combined workflow where we're integrating data that we extract from the literature with, so this is nanoparticle treatments in terms of cell toxicity, and we have a heat map that shows some of the particles have a high effect in terms of toxicity and some have a low effect. And one of the things that we can routinely do now is for each of those nanomaterials, we can then generate a whole bunch of atomistic descriptors. So these are sort of from the first principles in the periodic table. We can then do enrichment of the data set. We can then generate also now some synthetic data. So this is where we're using interpolation approaches, and then we can do all sorts of data filtering. And critically then, all of those steps need to be documented and described so that if somebody else is reusing the data, they can track back the provenance of that data, whether it was from an experiment, whether it was from computational enrichment, whether it was from interpolation or synthetic approaches, or and what data was removed and why. So all of that documentation is critical. The next step then is the model development. So again, the feature selection, the normalization of the data, particularly for machine learning, which sort of approaches we're using, and then assessment of the applicability domain of the model. And again, we need to document all of that. And each model needs to have its own unique identifier. It needs to be described with rich metadata. And the metadata need to be accessible even if the model or the software is no longer available. And then the final step is the deployment of the model and its release. So, for example, as a software, as a web application, as a KNIME workflow through an API in a Jupyter notebook, however it's made available. And again, the steps involved in that. So for both verification and then that the software itself is listed in a registry. And this workflow and the approach of generating and curating a literature data set, then enriching it, then depositing it in a database and documenting it, developing the model and documenting the model either through a QSAR, model report form, through the MODA, through the OECD PBPK model template, or so on, and then the various ways of deploying it, deploying the software and the model to be open and accessible is all described in the deliverable. And then to summarize then, we in the deliverable developed a set of policy recommendations that would help to support the verification of nanoinformatics models and tools. The first one being the importance of the documentation of the data sets. And we are recommending that MODA become sort of an equivalent standard as the QMRF report and as the PBPK reporting format for PBPK models. And the reason of this is that once it's adopted as a standard, it would have equivalent importance to QMRF. And for the QSAR model report format, there are numerous tools that will help to automatically generate those that can use much more controlled and structured templates with much less free text and therefore much less risk of errors or poor quality information in the templates. So by adopting it as a standard, then a whole bunch of services grow up around it to support its implementation. The QSAR Model Toolbox is another well-established platform that supports the deployment of QSAR models. And again, a recommendation from our work is that it would be excellent for the QSAR Model Toolbox to also look at the recommendations of the RDA FAIR for Research Software Principles, and also the additional considerations that we identified for nanoinformatics models. We also looked at deployment of nanoinformatics models to the European Open Science Cloud platform. And while it is possible and it is doable, one of the caveats we identified is that the scale of the user community for nanoinformatics models is likely to remain well below the level or the critical mass needed to sustain a cluster of activity on EOSC. But that's not to say it shouldn't be done, but particularly until some of the models become regulatory approved, it will be a more sort of a research community rather than a pure implementation community. And then in terms of the research around nanoinformatics, the key recommendations are that we really do need to move beyond black box approaches, particularly in the machine learning side, and aim to really demonstrate causality in the models. And in terms of maximizing the fairness of models, model developers are encouraged to document the model in the software, again using MODA and QMRF, to register the model in the Emerging Materials Models Registry, which includes its provenance and its reuse conditions or extension conditions, ensuring access to their models and software either through a web interface, an API, a KNIME node, or containerization and deployment to EOSC or other cloud platforms. And of course, providing user guides, tutorials, and training materials suitable for all users without necessarily having to need full, coding and software skills. And this one links, I think, back to Evan's presentation just a moment ago, that one of the key pieces of feedback we got on the deliverable from the chemistry case study was to make sure when we are integrating chemical structures into our various nanoinformatics models, to make sure that the conformation and or to be aware that the conformation and stereochemistry can vary, and thus that automated checking and validation steps are needed to confirm the chemical structures. So the API that was just presented will be hugely useful for that. And then I think we can't underestimate the need for training resources and support for master's and PhD level training for in data management and nanoinformatics. So overall, our work package for our nanomaterials case study has been organising and collating the existing materials to support FAIR nanomaterials data and models, and to provide practical guidance for their use to the community. We've been aiming to address gaps in standards, including representing and identifying materials. So we've been working on extending the INSHE to also cover nanomaterials, and we've been implementing on-the-fly approaches for ontology, annotation, metadata annotation, etc. And really trying to drive a change in the mindset of our nanomaterials community to understand the value and benefit of verifying data, and to moving the process of verification to much earlier in the data life cycle. So integrating it into the study design phase, rather than being something that happens at the end of the project and is just part of the tick boxing of the final reporting. And then just finally to say that all of our outputs and learnings are transferable to other interdisciplinary domains and are aligned with the WorldFAIR cross-domain implementation framework. We couldn't do this without a huge number of projects that have preceded WorldFAIR and that are continuing after WorldFAIR, so including PARC, Macrame and PINK in particular, where we're testing some of these on real-world cases. So to go from the theoretical to the practical implementation. And to thank all of you for listening and for your interest in the WorldFAIR nanomaterials deliverables. Thank you.
Thank you, Isolde. Many thanks for that. So we do have a few minutes now for questions. Is there anyone from our audience that would like to ask a question, either in the chat or you can unmute and ask in person? I don't see anything in the chat. You can raise your hand or you can just unmute and directly ask a question. No? Oh, Matti.
So yeah, sorry, I joined a little bit in the middle, but I dug up the SEN material science workshop agreement, and I'm just wondering how this sort of, let's say, the formal standardization process and the community standard process, how do they interact or clash?
They don't clash at all, because one of them, the formal ones, are addressing the data-driven model, so specifically QSARs and things, whereas the SEN workshop agreement is focused on materials models and physics-based models. So it's filling a gap that wasn't covered by, or addressing a need of the community. So, and the SEN workshop agreement, I think, is a first step towards then developing a fuller standard. So I think they're complementary as far as I can see, and the mapping that we did to the RDA FAIR for research software also shows that these two approaches for documenting informatics models are very well aligned with the principles for verification of research software, but they really are about documenting the modeling approach.
So in a way, the SEN is going to be one of the, let's say, exploitation parts after the project, or?
Yes, that would be an important route after the project. Yes.
Thanks, Matti. Any other questions from our attendees? No. In this case, I have a question for our panel. So, Isolde, you mentioned the cross-domain interoperability framework, and we have 11 case studies, disciplinary and cross-disciplinary case studies at the WorldFAIR project. So I was wondering if any of our speakers would like to speak a little bit about any use cases, either within chemistry, within nanomaterials, or cross-disciplinary, or outside your disciplines, where your work might have applicability. Who would like to take this question?
Well, with chemistry protocols, you need APIs that will allow you to interact with different parts of chemistry, other parts of science. The really hard thing is it's too much for humans to ask all the questions. And now and more, we're using so-called machine learning and AI-based approaches. So really, the more we can enable computers to ask questions on their own, so to speak, or on behalf of a human user, to amalgamate and pull information together and compact it in some way that is easier to digest, I think would be a huge benefit. And so by eliminating a lot of these barriers to that access, will really go a long way.
Thank you, Evan. Would anyone like to add anything to that? Because we do have a question from the audience now, so I can move on to that unless somebody wants to. No? Right, so Camille, would you like to ask your question directly? No. Okay, so question
Yes,
to you. Oh yeah,
yes.
go ahead.
Yes,
Yes, thank you.
Sorry about that. So it's a question, Stuart. In one of the slides, you showed the IUPAC Gold Book API definitions, and many of these definitions, as you can see in the Gold Book on the website, contain mathematical formulas or contain definitions like, for example, the conversion of units. How fair are these definitions in terms of importing directly these formulas from API to Python?
Great question. At this moment, I would say they're not as fair as they could be and should be, but we are working on this. Just as a reference point, we are currently going through a very large update to the Goldbook website. And so the number of definitions will increase by a factor of 2. And in addition to that, of course, there will be lots of additional equations, unit representations, quantity symbols, and another IUPAC project, which is the 5th edition of the IUPAC Green Book, which is going to be a digital first, is also working on latex strings for the representation of units and quantity symbols. And those will be integrated into the way the equations are set up. And my hope is that that will mean we will be able to come up with a sort of in a sense, a JSON way to represent the mathematics with the symbols in LaTeX and almost define those LaTeX strings as unique strings relative to a particular quantity symbol or a unit representation. So the answer to in the end, I think this is going to get a lot better in terms of being fair.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and I'm looking forward for this development actually. And I hope and I have another question, and this time question to Ishal. About the nanoinformatics, and one of the slides you showed us the CIF file as the input file for physics-based models in nanoinformatics. However, we know that due to the tiny size of nanoparticles and considering also boundary conditions, we can have completely different structure from that of the bulk crystal. So I'm wondering how well the bulk crystal models from the CIF files work for nanomaterials.
That is a great question, but it's probably a little bit beyond my capability to answer, in that I am not the one who does the modeling, but I am supporting in terms of documenting the models. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question, but I could put you in touch with the group that have done the modeling. So a lot of that is from Vladimir Lebaskin's group in University College Dublin. So I am happy to put you in touch with Vladimir if that's something that's useful.
That would be great.
Because he will certainly have thought about those questions, and I know they use, that they optimize which CIF file they use depending on the size of the material they're going to be simulating. So if it's okay, I'll put you in touch with Vladimir directly.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thanks.
super.
Thank you. We are running a little bit over time, but if there are any more questions from the audience, I think we can take one more. You can raise your hand or put it in the chat. Nope. Okay, so in terms of next steps, we are reaching the end of the project now, the end of May. So if the community is interested to continue engaging with your work, both for chemistry and for nanomaterials, how can they reach out to you? How can they engage with your ongoing work? And I have part of the answer towards the end of this event.
Is this a question to me or to everybody?
To all our panelists.
Oh, okay. Well, at least for the protocols, we provided a couple different links. So perhaps they could be sent out to everybody. But these are primary ways to get involved or learn more about what we're doing and to contribute.
For the nanomaterials work, we have our community platform, the NanoCommons user guide, which is a good starting point to find who is currently working in the field. We have a number of projects that are continuing to pick up a lot of this, and that will be organising additional workshops and training events, including Pink. Thomas Exner, I think, is on the call, or he was. Maybe he's dropped off now. I don't see him on the list now. But he's coordinating Pink, and there are multiple nano informatics and WorldFAIR nano data projects continuing that we would be most happy to engage others in and get feedback from the community on uptake of the resources or how we can help with uptake of the resources.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I don't see any more questions from the audience, so I will now give my answer to this last question, if that is okay. So, let's share my screen. So the WorldFAIR project is running two sessions, and the next RDA virtual plenary, which takes place from the 14th of the 20th to the 23rd of May. We have two sessions. The first one takes place on the 22nd of May, from 12 to 2 UTC, where a selection of case studies will describe their work and their experience of using the FAIR implementation profiles, and also discuss the key recommendations from the use of metadata standards and terminologies and structure around the most important themes and issues encountered during the lifetime of the project. The second session will take place on the 23rd of May, same time, 12 to 2 UTC, and this session will be focused on the cross-domain interoperability framework and our findings there. Our case studies, all of our case studies, including those present in the current meeting, are involved in the Research Data Alliance, either interest groups or working groups, and they will be there in various group sessions related to the WorldFAIR and other topics as well. So we encourage everyone to attend and take part of these group meetings. So the registration for the plenary is on the link here on the screen. I will also put it in the chat and the follow-up email to our attendees. And it is a virtual plenary, so hopefully a little bit easier for everyone to join. And with that, I think we can conclude this webinar. And I'd like to thank our speakers, Stuart Chalk, Evan Bolton, and Isolde Lynch for their presentations today. And thank you to all of our attendees for being here from all over the world, as far as I can see, which is great. Thank you. And we hope to see you soon.